welcome everybody. It's really great to see you and thank you very much for having me. So today in Secrets Revealed, we're going to be talking about the poor. It's obviously quite a big subject, particularly talking about them over the last 100 or so, a couple of 100 years. And we're going to be focusing particularly on the poor law, and we're also going to be talking a little bit about workhouses and some other sort of adjacent topics as well. We're going to dive straight in and start with talking about the overseers of the poor. So before 1834, poor relief was the responsibility of individual parishes. So they had to look after any resident unable to support themselves. And the Poor Law Act of 1597 to 8 required parishes to appoint overseers of the poor. So they were chosen from local householders and they were there to manage the poor, and their responsibilities included the following. So obviously of those, perhaps what might surprise you a little bit is they had this outdoor relief. And the idea of the outdoor relief was to help people actually at home. Indoor relief was to help people if they were in almshouses or they were in a workhouse. And if you're wondering what the difference is between almshouses and workhouses, essentially there's two really big ways that we can distinguish the two. The first is architecturally. If it was an almshouses, they tended to be, not always, but they tended to be a row of cottages. If it was a workhouse, certainly later on, workhouses, as we're going to see later on in the session, sort of adhered to a particular type of plan, and they all tended to look fairly similar, and certainly they were quite different from the idea of a row of cottages. They looked in fact more like a jail. The other big difference between them was who was actually running them and where that money came from. So almshouses tended to date back to the medieval period, and they tended to be run on money from individuals, largely left in their wills. Whereas if we look at workhouses, they actually came from charging a pool rate to individuals of the parish. So that's sort of a little bit of a difference between the two. They also had to provide suitable help. This meant sort of relief in kind. So they did give money, but they were more inclined a lot of the time to give things like clothing, food and fuel. And we're also going to be seeing that they also gave items that might help enable that person to go into work. They also helped them to find work within the local area. And finally, their job was to levy and collect the poor rate itself. So that came from householders, and you could get into quite a lot of trouble if you didn't pay up your poor rate. You could actually end up being brought in front of the magistrates if you didn't pay it. So relief in kind could take many forms, as I was saying. This extract is from Painswick Parish Records, so that's from 1784, and it orders that John Bailey was to be lent 3 shillings to buy a new scythe by the Painswick overseers. So this would have been repaid by John Bailey in small weekly amounts. So in this case, we can see that it was considered to be helpful to give somebody the means to work. So here we have the second one. So this is from 1759, and it lists various items that were given to the parish poor as outdoor relief. So these are the people who are living outside the almshouses and outside the workhouses. And you can see that a lot of them involve clothing, also some food. And again, you can see some of them had equipment to help them work. And we can see 2 of the women on this list were actually given a spinning wheel. There was other poor relief. There were charities at the time, and this was often directed towards providing houses for the poor. Quite often we have individuals who are leaving properties, and either the rent could be used or those people could actually live in those houses. If they were almshouses and they were left by wealthy people, quite frequently you were only allowed to live in them if you were of a good character, and you can decide for yourself what that actually means. And frequently as well, they were asked to pray on behalf of that person's soul. So slightly different again to workhouses. So this is a page showing you the poor rate. So this is from Thornbury Overseers account from 1657, and we can see the poor rate that's being collected from the parish. They had to first estimate how much poor relief money was needed in the parish, and then what they would do is they would charge the individual parishioners depending on the value of their property. So quite interesting that this is if you follow the poor rate through, it ends up being what we would now call the council tax. And still today, council tax is based on property. They did sort of sway slightly with the poll tax back in the early 90s, but it's very much property based now. And the rates was collected monthly, and in this instance, the amounts range from 1 pence a month to 5 shillings 6 pence a month. So that's roughly 40p, 44p to £29. So quite a difference depending on what you were paying. And the overseers were often left properties and wills after people died. And such properties could be used either as housing or they were rented out and the rent itself was used. And for example, we have records. We have a record of the expenditure for repairing the widow Cornock's houses, which you can just see there. And the house was repaired by Henry Ham, who then rented the estate. Okay. So here we have calendars or lists in the back of the Bisley Parish Register, which shows the new poor law of 57 to 8 in operation. And these are removal orders that record the parish sending those it believed to belong elsewhere, either back to their place of birth if it was known, or to their last place of residence. And we're going to talk quite a bit about this and about removal orders, but we have some quite interesting examples of, for example, women who were about to give birth being moved literally over the boundary from one parish to the other, so that the parish didn't end up having the upkeep of the woman and her child once the baby was born. And paupers received a passport that allowed them to claim relief en route to their destination, and gave them protection from being whipped as vagrants, which was something that could happen. They could also be put in the stocks. There we go. I'll just let you have a look at that, and then we've got a transcription of it in a moment. Okay, there we go. So if you just want to have a little read of that.
While you're having a read, just to say that the sound is slightly dipping in quality at times. So, audience, if you miss anything or you need Gemma to repeat anything, put a little note in the chat, and we'll make sure that you get to hear anything you've missed.
Thank you, Kate. Yeah, so here we can see different people being given these passports that allowed them to travel back to wherever it was they were being sent, probably there where they were actually born. And you can see that generally they were giving them a fair amount of time to get back to that place. And this lists the apprenticing of a Bisley orphan. It was an attractive option for a parish, as it relieved them of having to maintain the apprentice who would be brought up in a trade that would provide them with a living. Quite interestingly, this idea of apprenticing paupers, more often than not, they were unable to be given, they weren't, it was decided not to give them a high skilled apprenticeship. And most of the time they ended up with apprenticeships that led them into either being a servant or a labourer. And they usually started at the age of 9 and 10 and were for longer terms than usual apprenticeships. In fact, if you were a boy, a man, normally you went on to about the age of 24. If you were a woman, you went on to the age of 21 or until you were married. And here we hear about one of these individuals, Savage's wench. So the Thornbury Overseers accounts contain a series of entries for a pauper apprentice identified only as Savage's wench or Savage's daughter. And from the parish registers, we think that she was actually a woman called Elizabeth Savage, who was baptised in October 1643 and became an orphan when her last surviving parent, Thomas Savage, died in 1645. And what happened was that she was apprenticed to a man in Bristol, probably to be a domestic a servant. And the parish paid him an inducement and his expenses. And that was quite common to begin with. Later on, it was scrapped, this idea of paying people to take on paupers. Although if you were apprenticed, generally still the master received an amount of money, and it generally went that way. Although I have come across a couple of examples where a master was paying for an apprenticeship, which is quite interesting, but I don't suppose that really happens with pauper apprenticeships. Anyway, in the event the placement went wrong, we don't know why. It could be for a number of reasons. It might have been that that she didn't like her master, perhaps he was unkind, abusive, or it may just be that she wanted to go back to Thornbury, but she ran back there again. She was returned, but she kept running away. And eventually the parish gave up returning her and apprenticed her to a local Thornbury man. And there she seems to have stayed after that, or at least we didn't hear any more about her after this. So here we have the orders for the Biddle of Beggars in 1619. So Cirencester and Tewkesbury appointed a Beadle of Beggars to help control begging, collect the poor rate and enforce town poor laws in general. So I'll just let you read that bit for yourself. So trying to get away from the idea of having people begging was incredibly important. And this meant that they were often trying to find work for the poor, as I was saying right at the beginning. They often gave grants to people who promised to provide employment. And this is part of a letter to Lord Berkeley's steward, John Smythe, and relates to an attempt to get a man called Tisley to set up a pin making scheme in Berkeley in 1627. And he managed to establish a pin workshop. And he had been loaned £100 by the city, which is quite a lot of money, about 12,000 today, to set up a business. But he actually made the equivalent of £245,000 from the venture. And certainly there were plenty of people who were benefiting from having pauper apprentices. There are numerous examples of this if you look at the records, but for example, you have quite a lot of apprenticeships, and I use the term loosely here, of very young children, quite often as young as 6, being used in the mills and the mines under the term apprenticeship, although really it isn't what we would consider to be an apprenticeship. And here we have the churchwarden's accounts for Upton St Leonard's, and this is 1694 to 5. And churchwardens were obviously often involved in carrying out overseers' duties. And these extracts show typical payouts. And a reminder there that vagrants could be whipped if they did not have a pass. And here we have what happened to pregnant women. So pregnant women, vagrants, were usually given more money, but they were still moved on because they didn't want them to end up with the child, bringing them up using the poor rates. And we've got this wonderful example that gave to a great bellied woman and to 3 women to bring her away, and it's 3 shillings, and that's actually quite a lot of money at the time. And I think it just goes to show how keen they were to get rid of looking after this woman and her child, that they were prepared to have 3 women to take her someplace else. And here we have the overseer's accounts from Hardwick in 1701. And overseers would often maintain payments as long as required. And these accounts, you can show multiple payments over long periods of time. And we have a couple of examples here of Joyce Teast, and we also have Widow Jennings. But on a sort of more macabre note, sometimes these expenses actually didn't have to be paid for very long. And we have later on, we have Joyce Teast has actually died, as we can see, is being laid out for a coffin. But they obviously liked her quite a lot, because they also put on bread and cheese at her funeral, which we have to expect was not something that they did for everybody. And we'll, just before we move on, in a little bit, we'll talk about what it meant to be somebody who's considered to be the deserving poor versus the undeserving poor. So now we have this really interesting element, which is called badging the poor. Badging the poor was literally putting a badge onto a person to signal them out as having poor money given to them. We think that this actually goes back to at least the medieval period, although it might go back, the late medieval period, it might go back earlier than that. And what it involved was, it was to show close links. What this does is it shows close links between charity and public relief. This will is paying for benefits which might otherwise be provided by the parish, and to show the custom of badging the poor, requiring recipients of the poor relief to wear a badge of signs so they could be easily identified and prevent them from begging. And if I just click on to the next one so that you can see what this letter says. So as well as giving out money, Timothy Norse got the pleasure of having his initials put on this badge that those receiving his money had to wear. So saw very early advertising. It wasn't always like that. More traditionally, it was either a red or a blue badge put onto the shoulder, and it generally had a P for poor, and then it had an initial for the name of the parish. So if the parish had been Tewkesbury, for example, you would have a P and then a T. But certainly this idea of putting the person who's sponsoring them their initials was also something that happened. Oh, and just to say, if you're wondering about this, this is an idea that went on from at least the medieval period, and it got, I think it was 1810 that they abolished this idea, largely because it ended up being something that was so much, they liked the idea of it being a deterrent, but it ended up being something which people were so not keen on that they decided to get rid of it. It's thought that at the beginning it was actually done in a more positive way, because it was to signal out people who needed to be given food and so on by people in the parish. So it probably started a bit more positively, but ended up quite the opposite. So here we have some information about the poor at Newent. So this book lists some of the poor of the town of Newent from 1784 to 1789, and the forthright nature of the comments highlight the prevailing idea of the deserving and undeserving poor. So if we first of all look at the deserving poor, so that's sort of fairly clear that this is the deserving poor. The undeserving poor, they do not pull their punches. Perhaps the less said of her daughter, the better. The husband is a profligate and idle. Sorry, I can't speak. And then the next one, which I think is It's even worse. If not sent to sea soon, will undoubtedly make his exit at the gallows, and as vile a woman as any in the parish. And this idea of the deserving and the undeserving is something which underpins so much of how the poor were treated throughout history, and certainly to today as well. So as for medical care, those who received poor relief were also cared for medically if they fell ill. And this page from Upton St Leonard's actually records George Rodway to the parish of St Leonard's bleeding various women. And at the time, the idea of bleeding, this has been going on for a good 2,000 years by then, and was used as a sort of tonic or pick-me-up, considered sort of beneficial to health. And you can see the bill for bleeding and travel expenses for 14 women came to approximately £42 for today. And let's just click on to some more. There we go. And here we have a very handy list of the sort of things that were being treated, or the way they were treating people, I should say. So dressing wounds, providing purging draught, purging powders, strengthening powders, trepanning operations. So that's where they drill the hole in the head. That's the oldest surgical procedure, I believe, in the world. And that was still being used as late as 1794, even later than that. There was also other ways that they were treating people. They would have had things like pain relief as well. Anything that could be treated fairly successfully at the time. And the overseers also generated records, which are a valuable resource for researchers. So if you're thinking of doing some research into this yourself, it's certainly worth looking at the settlement examinations. So a justice of the peace would examine anyone who moved into a parish to establish their place of legal settlement. So this is this idea of removing or letting people stay. Settlements can include detailed biographical information about an individual family members, so very useful for us as historians. And removal orders, these were issued when the parish in which the person needed support sent them back to their last place of legal settlement. So that might generally be where they were born, but sometimes to the last place of residence. And there are two kinds of orders. There are those that remove people from the parish, and then orders to remove people to the parish. We'll just see some examples of these. Okay, let's click on to the next one. If I am moving too quickly for any of you, just to remind you that we are recording this session and that this will go up on our Gloucestershire Archives YouTube channel in the next week or so. So if you do want to review any of the things that are being said today, please do go back and have a look at the recording. Okay, so one more. And here we actually have some additional information that went with this removal order. Okay. Okay, but the poor were always with us. So by the early 1830s, it was becoming clear that the old parish system of poor relief was outdated, it was expensive, and it was inefficient. And this was especially noticeable in the south, where the cost of poor relief in the agricultural districts had risen dramatically, primarily because it had become a way of topping up the paltry low wages of the agricultural labourers. And because the poor rate increases were largely funded by the middle and upper classes, there soon grew a real suspicion that they were simply paying out for the poor to be lazy and avoid work. And this is, again, the kind of attitude that we see throughout this point. So unhappy upper classes soon translated into parliamentary concern. In an 1832, a royal commission was set up to investigate the existing system and make recommendations for changes. And what happened was this report proposed radical changes, and it was welcomed by MPs, especially as the old system was to be reformed in such a way as to deter people from making unnecessary demands on public funds. And the 1834 Poor Law Amendment was passed, and immediately the whole county was divided into these poor law unions, about 650 in all, each of which was administered by an elected board of guardians who are in charge with care of the poor in their local area. And the changes included that they would no longer have any outdoor relief, so it would only be given actually within workhouses, that these workhouses would be segregated by sex and age to ensure proper regulation, and this meant that families were separated and couples were split up. And mothers of illegitimate children were to receive less support because it was thought that if they were supporting them fully, then it would be promoting bastardy. So they tended to look down upon the lower classes who seemed unable or unwilling to control their errant sexual desires. Standard treatment of paupers, this was meant to reduce the cost of looking after the poor and impose a system which would be the same all over the country. So under the poor laws, each union had to build a workhouse if they didn't already have one. And in most instances, existing parish workhouses were unfit for purpose, and so mini construction began as new workhouses were built. And these were built to look very much like prisons, and we can see an example here of what they looked like. And I'm going to show you a few local ones now. Oh, sorry, that's the next one. So this is partially deliberate because they wanted it to look worse. They didn't want people to go into the workhouse, as I'm sure you're all aware of. They wanted it to be as a deterrent as much as possible. So they only wanted the people who were absolutely desperately in need. They've got no other option to go into the workhouse. And you can probably spot from some of the cartoons that I've been showing you that there was quite a lot of opposition to the way the poor were being treated in this new poor law. There we go. And Gloucestershire was covered by 20 unions, which you can see below. And those are the references if you want to look things up. So here's some images of what they look like. As you can see, most of them are following a very similar plan. Most of them have got this idea of segregation. Now, if you want to see a good example of a workhouse, and I do really recommend this, if you are listening to this talk and think, yeah, I'd like to know a bit more about it, I'd really recommend going up to Nottinghamshire, and the details are given at the end of this talk, to see the workhouse and infirmary that they have up there. And it is absolutely fantastic. I've been a couple of times. I went a couple of weeks ago in advance of this talk. And if you want to see everything that we're talking about today played out in very much a very real situation, it is fantastic. It really is. Give yourself plenty of time because there's a lot to see. But it is really, really worth going to have a look. There we go. And then we can see the plan. So here we have the ground floor. And let's have a look at the upper floor. Those who are considered to be the deserving poor, for example, people who were very aged, they tended to have slightly nicer rooms, slightly bigger fires, depending on the workhouse. And you can see they're very imposing. Especially if you go to the front doors in a lot of these workhouses, they were deliberately created to be imposing for people coming in. So the workhouses, as you'll expect, were subject to numerous rules and regulations. They do differ slightly depending on the workhouse, but from all the ones I've looked at, they don't differ very much. And it's interesting that if you did break the rules more than a couple of times, that you ended up in prison. There was this direct connection between the workhouse and the jail. Okay. One of the sort of myths of the workhouse is that they didn't get much food and drink, and that's not actually true. It was quite boring. Lots of bread, lots of soup, lots and lots of potatoes. But actually, for most of the workhouses, we will see a couple of exceptions in a moment, but for most workhouses, those who were living there were fed pretty well. And you can see the daily bread allowance at Tewkesbury, for example, was between 14 and 17 slices a day, which is quite a large amount. Okay. And when people leave the workhouse, they were assigned to a class of diet according to their health, their age, and their fitness. And these classes, again, they did vary slightly over the years, but I'd say this is pretty standard, what you're looking at in front of you. And although you didn't have the variety of diet that you would expect to be suggested today, for example, things like fruit, a variety of vegetables, for example, it certainly wasn't the worst diet. It was created from the cheapest ingredients, though. And it was slightly different according to who you are. So if you were a child, you're infirm, you tended to have a slight more variety than everybody else. And the unions purchase supplies using the tender process, such as Tewkesbury Union seen here. I was pretty horrified to find out that although most of the time it was okay, sometimes it was stored really badly, and it wasn't totally unusual for inmates to have to pick rat feces from their oatmeal, which is pretty grim. And there we can actually see a cartoon of one of the incidents, the most famous being in 1845 at Andover in Hampshire, where they were fighting over bones that they were actually supposed to be crushing for fertilizers. So there were these examples where people weren't being fed brilliantly. Those are the ones that sort of stuck in people's mind, rather than the general, which was actually a lot better than that. And much of what we know about the Poor Laws unions comes from the minutes of the meetings of the Board of Guardians. And here we've got an example of that. They tend to be extremely detailed, which is really useful to us if we're trying to find out more about the workhouses, about the poor law, but they are a little bit monotonous. And there are lots of other types of poor law union records as well. I'll just give you a moment to read that through and make a note if there are any there that are useful to you. One of the areas that's really interesting, in fact, you could do a whole talk on this. I think it's, one of the most fascinating elements of the workhouse is this bit that it says about the records relating to lunatics. Now, you probably are expecting that by the point of bringing in workhouses, that you would have those classed as those who were mentally ill being sent off to asylums, but in fact that wasn't always the case, and quite a lot of people who had mental illness ended up in workhouses. They were only supposed to be there for 2 weeks maximum and then moved into an asylum, but actually a lot of the time, because it was much less money to keep somebody in a poorhouse as opposed to an asylum, sometimes people did end up being there for a lot longer. Also, at the beginning of the 1800s, you haven't got asylums everywhere. You haven't got they're not always readily available to house different people within a county. And so what happens is you do get people in the asylum and they are treated as you would probably expect, with misunderstanding, sometimes quite brutally as well. And quite often they were grouped all together too. And you've got these sort of really awful language, really, of lunatics, feeble-minded, weak-minded, idiots, and they all sort of slightly cover slightly different areas of mental illness. But it's really worth, if you're interested in that, I would say that there's a whole area there that is worth exploring. Really, really fascinating and sad as well. So here we have an admission register from Newent Poor Law Union. Sorry, I need just a little drink. Sorry about that. There we go. We've got a couple of examples. This idea of breaking up stone daily was a real thing that they were doing. And when I was at the workhouse in Nottinghamshire, they had an example of this out in the yard, and it really brought it to life, how brutal it must have been breaking up the stone. Oh, sorry, I went too quick. Yeah, so it's interesting that if you did sort of disappear from the workhouse in the clothing, then that could be treated quite seriously. You could end up in prison. So if they were able to track people who had abandoned their families to the workhouse, they would try to do so. And most of the workhouses did have schools in them. And again, if you go up to the workhouse in Nottinghamshire, you'll see that for yourself. Depending on the apprentice, what was supposed to happen was that if you were apprenticed to somebody, you would have a minimum of 6 weeks with them. And at the end of that sort of 6 weeks or a bit longer, you'd be brought up in front of the magistrate and you'd be questioned according to your lodgings, how you're being fed, how you were being treated. And then only after that would it have been made permanent. But from what I've read, it looks like that wasn't always the case. And sometimes there was this compassionate absence as well. And new beginnings, and occasionally the union would actually pay for paupers to emigrate, to start new lives, generally because they felt that they would be looking after these people in the long term, and so therefore it was worth paying out for them to go elsewhere. So here we have an interesting example of Mary Meadows, and she had 3 children, and she was given the equivalent of about £1,200 today in order to emigrate. I think it was Quebec she was going. Yes, she was. Yes, sorry. So although that seems quite a lot of money, the alternative of looking after her and her family indefinitely presumably made the union feel this was worth paying out for. There we go. That sort of reminds me slightly. There's a lot here that's very Dickensian, isn't there? That we're sort of reading about, and when I was reading this, I was very much reminded of that sort of initial scene in Oliver Twist, where where the sort of board of guardians are all having this great big slap up roast dinner, whilst everybody else is on porridge. But here we can see they were given a nice slap up dinner for Christmas Day. And like most official government organisations, they did keep really good statistics. And here we can see the number of people receiving poor relief. And you can see they've dropped the idea of no outdoor relief. In fact, we have 9 who are being helped in their own homes. And again, this is really all to do with money as much as anything else. It was just considered to be less expensive to look after people in this way. Here we have this fabulous picture. Yeah, so this idea developed where you had sort of professional vagrants who would go from one workhouse to the other, or from one casual job to the other, and they would be able to stay in a workhouse and do some work for them. It's definitely one of my favourite pictures. So one effect was that they had these casual wards. This is what we're talking about. So what it would mean is that you could, if you were a vagrant, you could stay at the workhouse overnight. You'd then be required to do a day's labour, and a day of labour tended to be either the stone breaking we talked about before, or else picking oakum. So this is the sort of loose fibres that were picked apart, often covered in tar, that were then used to make things like rope or used within boats and ships. And it really hurts your fingers after a bit. It's really awful. And I don't need to explain why stone breaking would have been pretty hard work. And then they were given this ticket that allowed them to go to the next area. I should have mentioned earlier that things like breaking up stone and picking oakum as well, to an extent, tended to be a male job. With the women in workhouses, they tended to be responsible for the laundry and the cooking and things like that. They also did pick oakum as well. Here we go, and here we have the recommendations of the Royal Commission on the Poor Laws and Relief of Distress in 1909. So as we can see, eventually the workhouses were abolished, and the eventual replacement of that would be the NHS, although there's obviously this gap between the two. So what was the poor rates eventually became part of the general rates that were charged to individuals for looking after roads, providing sanitation and all those kind of things. So it became part of a much bigger rate. And like I was saying at the beginning, eventually that would follow through into basically what we have today, which is council tax. As for the workhouses, like I said, they eventually turned out travelled through and became part of the National Health Service. And they were either closed or they continued as hospitals or as old people's homes. And there we can see that magnificent frontage on the Gloucester Workhouse. There aren't many pictures of this. Okay, so thank you ever such a lot for listening. I'm sure your heads are stuffed with poor law and workhouse information. We've just got some other resources there that might be of useful to you, and you'll see that one that I particularly flagged up on places to visit. I'm sure there's other great ones as well, but I can't recommend that one enough for talking about the sort of things that we've been covering today.
Thank you very much, Gemma. That was really interesting and very, very well done. Watch out, John Putley, I say. You've got Gemma on your heels. We've had a question already, Gemma, and that's from Pauline about where Gloucester Workhouse was. Do you know?
Do you know, I'm afraid I don't know. I don't know if anybody else can shed any light on that. I'm afraid I'm not a Gloucester girl. Pauline, if you would like to email into us, I'll find out for you and I'll come back to you. So our general email is archives@gloucestershire.gov.uk. So archives@gloucestershire.gov.uk, and I'll get back to you.
So Liz Jack, I thought Liz might know. It's on the site of Gloucester Royal Hospital, so where the hospital is now. Thank you very much, Liz.
Thank you.
Normally we have somebody in the audience who knows the answers when we don't know ourselves. Anybody else got any questions or things to add? You can put your camera on and put your hand up. If you don't want to use the chat facility. Liz says that a part of it is still there. So that image that you showed, Gemma, of the entrance there, apparently that's still there, but I can't think. I've been to the hospital. I can't think where that is. But thank you, Liz. So I'm just going to scroll down, see if anybody else has got. Any questions? Doesn't look like it. Just go back through. So unless anybody else has anything to add, we will call it a day. Thank you very much for attending, everybody, and thank you very much, Gemma, for doing the talk. Do you know the title of the next one is? What the next one is, Gemma? I normally talk about that, but I don't.
I think it's house history. In fact, have I got another page? Yes, I have. There we go.
Brilliant. Okay.
Sorry. Yes. So, So opening the door on house history, and the wonderful Don Putley will be back for that one. And just also to flag up, I'm myself and Kate. We do the Passport to the Past, which is the version of this that is done for children. And we're also going to be doing house history. We're going to be house detectives at our next one, which is on the 4th of May. So if you have any children or grandchildren who would like to attend that, please do let them know. And all the information is on the website for both of those ones. Well, thank you ever such a lot, everybody, for joining me. And I hope that sort of really whetted your appetite to find out a bit more. Please don't forget that, you know, we've obviously got all of these records here at Gloucestershire Archives if you want to come and see them for yourself. And if you do think of any questions after the fact, then you can see that the email is there, but you'll find it on our website. Please just drop me a line and I will endeavour to answer it.
Okay, so I'm going to end the meeting.
Thank you.
Oh, go on, Tony.
I was just saying it's very good talk. Very encouraging.
Thank you. It was, wasn't it?
Take more. We've got this workhouse just literally above me. It's just a bit higher up the road. It's good to see it's in proper use again now for ordinary people.
Oh, what's it used for?
It's accommodation. It was converted since the time we've been here. We've been here for 50 years now. And the workhouse is now fully converted. It's a bit cold, they say. It's one of those things in a stone building.
So whereabouts are you, if you don't mind me asking? Whereabouts are you?
I'm in very near to the hospital. Just above Waitrose.
Oh, okay. Okay. Very nice too.
It's a lovely location. It overlooks the cemetery. And if you want to have a very good home, convert the chapel there. You've got two kinds. You can have conformist and non-conformist, but at the moment it's got a spire at the top, easily recognised, and you've got the workhouse behind it.
Ideal.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, Joe.
Okay, so I'm going to end the meeting. Thanks, everybody, and hopefully we'll see you next time for the house history talk.
Good.